Various types of lung receptors provide feedback from the lungs to the respiratory center. So, the respiratory centers receive impulses and regulate the respiratory movements. So, let's have a look at the various receptors one by one and how the impulses from them affect respiratory centers. So, starting off with the impulses from higher centers. Well, higher centers alter the respiration by sending impulses directly to dorsal group of neurons or DRG. Impulses from some areas inhibit respiration, while the impulses from motor area of cerebral cortex cause forced breathing. The cerebral motor cortex sends impulses to the motor neurons, causing stimulation of respiratory muscles. This bypasses the medullary centers. Well, holding the breath is a limited function, and this is because the brainstem respiratory centers automatically reinitiate breathing once carbon dioxide levels in the blood become critical. Next, we are the impulses from stretched receptors of lungs. Well, stretch receptors are the receptors which give response to stretch of the tissues. These receptors are situated on the wall of the bronchi and bronchioles. Expansion of lungs during inspiration stimulates the stretch receptors. Then, impulses from stretch receptors reach the dorsal group neurons via vagal afferent fibers and inhibit them. So, inspiration stops and expiration starts. Thus, the overstretching of lung tissues is prevented, and this is called Hering-Breuer reflex. Well, you can say that it is a protective reflex that restricts inspiration and prevents overstretching of lung tissues. And of course, it is initiated by the stimulation of stretch receptors of air passage. However, Hering-Breuer reflex does not operate during quiet breathing. It operates only when the tidal volume increases beyond 1000 milliliters. Well, this was actually the Hering-Breuer inflation reflex, since it restricts the inspiration and limits the overstretching of lung tissues. Reverse of this reflex is called Hering-Breuer deflation reflex, and it takes place during expiration. During expiration, as the stretching of lungs is absent, deflation occurs. Now, the next receptors are the J receptors. J receptors are juxtacapillary receptors, which are present on the wall of the alveoli and have close contact with the pulmonary capillaries. These receptors are in fact the sensory nerve endings of vagus. Nerve fibers from these receptors are non-myelinated and belong to C-type. Well, few receptors are found on the wall of the bronchi. Now, how are J receptors stimulated? Well, J receptors are stimulated in various conditions like pulmonary congestion, pulmonary edema, pneumonia, overinflation of lungs, microembolism in pulmonary capillaries, and stimulation by exogenous and endogenous chemical substances such as histamine, bradykinin, and serotonin. Now, this stimulation of the J receptors produces a reflex response, which is characterized by apnea or rapid shallow breathing. Well, apnea is followed by hyperventilation, bradycardia, hypertension, and weakness of skeletal muscles. Now, role of J receptors in physiological conditions is not clear. However, these receptors are responsible for hyperventilation in patients affected by pulmonary congestion and left heart failure. Besides stretch receptors, there is another type of receptors in the bronchi and bronchioles of lungs called irritant receptors. Irritant receptors are stimulated by irritant chemical agents such as ammonia and sulfur dioxide, smoke and dust, rapid large inflations and deflations, airway deformation, pulmonary congestion, and inflammation. These are located throughout the airways between epithelial cells. What they do is that in the trachea they cause cough, and in the lower airways hyperpnoea or rapid breathing. Stimulation also causes bronchial and laryngeal constriction. They are also responsible for the deep augmented breaths every 5 to 20 minutes at rest, reversing the slow collapse of the lungs that occurs in quiet breathing and may be involved in the first deep gasps of the newborn. These receptors send afferent impulses to respiratory centers via vagal nerve fibers. Now, stimulation of irritant receptors produces reflex hyperventilation along with bronchospasm. Hyperventilation along with bronchospasm prevents further entry of harmful agents into the alveoli. Now, after irritant receptors, next we have baroreceptors. Well, baroreceptors or pressoreceptors are the receptors which give response to change in blood pressure. Baroreceptors residing in the carotid sinus and arch of aorta give response to increase in blood pressure. Whenever arterial blood pressure increases, baroreceptors are activated and send inhibitory impulses to vasomotor center in medulla oblongata. This causes decrease in blood pressure and inhibition of respiration. However, in physiological conditions, the role of baroreceptors in regulation of respiration is insignificant. Now, chemoreceptors play an important role in the chemical regulation of respiration. We will be discussing it in detail in the next section, under chemical mechanism. Now, you must have heard the term proprioceptors. What they actually are? Well, proprioceptors are the receptors which give response to change in the position of body. These receptors are situated in joints, tendons, and muscles. They are activated during movement of the limbs and are involved in the early stimulation of breathing during muscular exercise. Once stimulated, proprioceptors send impulses to brain, particularly cerebral cortex, through somatic afferent nerves. Now, cerebral cortex in turn causes hyperventilation by sending impulses to medullary respiratory centers. So, that was about proprioceptors. Next we have in the list are the impulses from thermoreceptors. Thermoreceptors are cutaneous receptors which give response to change in the environmental temperature. These are of two types, namely receptors for cold and receptors for warmth. Now, when body is exposed to cold, or when cold water is applied over the body, cold receptors are stimulated and send impulses to cerebral cortex via somatic afferent nerves. Cerebral cortex, in turn, stimulates the respiratory centers and causes hyperventilation. Now, lastly, another types of impulses are impulses from pain receptors. Well, pain receptors are those which give response to pain stimulus. Whenever pain receptors are stimulated, the impulses are sent to cerebral cortex via somatic afferent nerves. Cerebral cortex, in turn, stimulates the respiratory centers and causes hyperventilation. So, here we come to an end to this part. That was about the factors affecting respiratory centers, where we discussed various lung receptors and the impulses generated by them. Now, it's the time to move on to the last part of the video. That is about the chemical mechanism. So let's jump in.
Explore our extensive library of over 1,800 video lectures to learn about a wide range of topics. Only on sqadia.com.